Welcome to Warriors of the World. In today's episode, we will meet the privateers. Imagine yourself on the deck of a ship. Wind billowing in the sails, taste of salt lingering on your lips. For some, the vast ocean would be a source of dread. For the privateers, this was home. These sea warriors, like pirates, were authorized to loot in the name of kings and queens. Famous letter of marque turned what would be piracy into a legal act. To common sailors, privateers were heroes. To the ships that fell into their clutches, they were ruthless marauders. The sea has its own rules. Those who dare challenge it know the risks. The distinction between pirate and privateer may seem simple at first glance, but in practice, that line often blurred. Pirates were those who acted on their own, looting any ship they came across. No allegiance to any flag. Privateers, on the other hand, acted under the orders of a king or queen, with their letter of marque granting a form of legal permission to attack enemies. Both maneuvered dangerously close to each other. Many privateers crossed the line of legality, always tempted by gold and glory. In the end, for their victims, the difference mattered little. Privateers emerged during a time of intense rivalry between European nations. In the 16th century, major powers like Spain, France, England, and the Netherlands were vying for territories and wealth, especially in the Americas. Gold and silver from the New World flowed across the oceans, and naval warfare became an extension of land conflicts. Official navies weren't large enough to protect or attack all trade routes, and privateers became the ideal solution. Sea warriors who acted as an unofficial extension of the navy, weakening the enemy's trade. The letter of marque was the document that set privateers apart from pirates. With it, the privateer was legally authorized to attack and loot enemy ships. This created a curious situation. What for some was a criminal activity, for others was a patriotic service. The letter of marque outlined the rules the privateer had to follow, such as dividing the spoils between the crown and the crew. However, control over privateers was not always strict, and many took advantage of the opportunity to act independently. Once at sea, far from the eyes of the law, what truly stopped someone from becoming a pirate? Life aboard a privateer ship was not for the weak. Storms, disease, hunger, and the constant threat of battle turned every voyage into a test of survival. Privateer ships, smaller and more agile than large warships, allowed for quick, decisive attacks. However, daily life aboard was grueling. Space was limited, food was scarce, and tension among the crew was high. But the promise of great fortune kept these men at sea, enduring the harshest conditions in exchange for a share of the treasure. Privateers relied on fast, agile ships to carry out their attacks. Frigates and brigs were the preferred vessels, armed with cannons capable of inflicting significant damage on enemy merchant ships. Speed was essential. Privateers attacked by surprise and escaped before reinforcements arrived. Besides the cannons, handheld weapons like short swords, pistols, and knives were vital for the close-quarters combat that occurred when boarding a ship. It was a fierce fight, where each man had to battle for his survival and, of course, for the treasure that awaited them. Among the privateers, some became legends. Sir Francis Drake, perhaps the most famous, was a hero to England and a scourge to Spain. His name was synonymous with terror on the seas as he plundered Spanish riches in the Americas. Another example is Henry Morgan, who, despite his controversial beginnings as a privateer, gained official recognition and became the governor of Jamaica. The line between criminal and hero was fluid, and these men skillfully navigated between both worlds, making the most of the chaos that reigned over the oceans at the time. For a privateer, the element of surprise was key to success. They waited for days, sometimes weeks, in bays or strategic points, until an unsuspecting merchant ship came into view. Then, the attack was swift and devastating. Grappling hooks were thrown, and privateers boarded the enemy vessel with calculated ferocity. Cannons fired only as much as necessary to disorient and disarm, for the goal was to capture the ship and its cargo intact. The speed and precision of these attacks made privateers formidable and unpredictable foes on the seas. The goal of every privateer was to capture a prize, that is, a ship laden with riches. Each captured vessel represented a potential fortune for the captain and his crew. Gold, silver, spices, silk, and even entire ships became the spoils of war. After the capture, the prize was taken to a friendly port, where the cargo was assessed and divided. Part of the treasure was given to the crown that had issued the letter of marque, but the majority remained with the crew. For many, this was the real reason to risk their lives at sea, the promise of wealth beyond their wildest dreams. Privateers and pirates often found themselves at odds. While privateers had a form of legal protection, pirates were enemies of all nations, hunted by any navy that crossed their paths. However, the line between the two groups could be thin. A privateer who wasn't paid properly or who lost their letter of marque could easily turn to piracy. Likewise, experienced pirates could be hired as privateers, as long as they agreed to follow the rules set by the crown. This constant rivalry between pirates and privateers made the seas even more dangerous. France and Spain also used privateers to defend their shipping routes and attack rivals. French privateers, known as filibusters, were particularly active in the Caribbean, where they fought constant battles against Spanish ships transporting New World riches. Jean Bart, one of the most famous French privateers, was a real headache for both English and Spanish fleets, capturing numerous vessels. On the Spanish side, protecting the silver fleets was a priority, and Spanish privateers were often mobilized to defend their economic interests across the oceans. The era of privateers began to decline at the end of the 18th century. The development of more powerful and organized navies reduced the need for privateers. Moreover, peace treaties between major European powers reduced naval wars, limiting opportunities for privateering. By the early 19th century, the letter of marque was officially abolished in most countries. The last privateers had to choose between a life of piracy or retirement. What had once been seen as a heroic act of war became an echo of the past, relegated to the pages of history. Though most privateers were men, some women left their mark on the seas. Jeanne de Clisson, known as the Lioness of the Seas, is perhaps the most famous. After the execution of her husband for treason, she became an implacable avenger, attacking French ships with a loyal, justice-seeking crew. Disguised or openly, some women defied the social conventions of the time, proving that the spirit of a sea warrior did not depend on gender. They faced the same dangers, and some even commanded their own ships. Though known for their brutality, many privateers followed a code of honor aboard. Discipline was essential to the success of a crew. War spoils were divided fairly, with strict rules about who received what, depending on their rank aboard the ship. Captains who didn't follow these rules or mistreated their crew risked facing mutiny. However, outside the ship, this code was more flexible. If a privateer captured a neutral or allied ship, it only mattered if word didn't reach the crown. In the end, what counted was the success of the mission. Privateers may have disappeared, but their legacy continues to captivate. Films, books, and legends immortalize these sea warriors, romanticizing their dangerous, adventure-filled lives. While many see them as heroes or defenders of their nations, others consider them little more than pirates with a legal veil. However, the truth is that privateers played a crucial role in naval history, weakening enemy economies and defending trade routes. Their names may have been lost to the waves of time, but their stories still echo, feeding the fascination with the sea and its mysteries. Not all privateers died in battle or at sea. Some, like Henry Morgan, transformed their success on the seas into political power. Morgan began as a privateer and, after a career of plundering in the Caribbean, was rewarded with the position of Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica. For many privateers, this transition to life on land wasn't easy. Accustomed to the adrenaline of battle and the freedom of the sea, political life and civil responsibilities could feel mundane. However, for those who managed to adapt, the fortune they amassed at sea provided a comfortable life and even an entry into nobility. Privateers weren't just marauders. In many cases, their actions directly influenced diplomacy between nations. A successful attack on an enemy fleet could change the course of a war or force a nation to negotiate peace. Likewise, poorly disciplined privateers could cause unnecessary conflicts by attacking ships from neutral countries. Nations used privateers as a tool of indirect warfare, allowing them to weaken rivals without compromising their own naval resources. However, privateers often operated in a gray area of international politics. Life below the deck of a privateer ship was far less glamorous than tales of great battles and treasure suggest. Space was cramped, food was scarce, and hygiene was practically non-existent. Many men spent weeks without seeing sunlight, working exhausting shifts to keep the ship operational. The threat of disease was constant, and a simple fever could decimate the crew. However, for these men, the promise of great reward made all these sacrifices bearable. After all, a single successful attack could change their lives forever. Many privateer spoils never reached their final destination. Storms, ambushes, and betrayals along the route could result in the loss of untold riches. These stories of lost treasures continue to fascinate today, with treasure hunters scouring the ocean floor for chests full of gold and silver. Some legends speak of deserted islands where privateers buried their fortunes, waiting to return one day to retrieve them. These stories fuel the imagination and perpetuate the myth of the privateer as more than just a sea warrior, but as a keeper of secrets buried in the depths. As nations abolished the practice of privateering, the last privateers slowly disappeared from the seas. The famous Jean Lafitte, who operated in the Gulf of Mexico, is often considered one of the last true privateers. He helped the United States during the War of 1812 but continued his looting afterward, walking the line between legality and crime. Lafitte symbolizes the end of an era. As the world began to organize into nation-states with formal navies, privateers became obsolete. The era of sea adventurers was coming to an end, but their legacy still lives on in legend. While most privateer stories focus on the Atlantic and the Caribbean, the Mediterranean also had its share of privateers. For centuries, Muslim privateers, especially those from the Barbary coast, terrorized European trade routes. These North African privateers, funded by Ottoman rulers, captured ships and enslaved their crews. In response, Europeans, especially the Spanish and Italians, also recruited privateers to combat the threat. The Mediterranean became a battleground between Christians and Muslims, where holy war mixed with looting and piracy. After a successful capture, privateers didn't always deliver the spoils directly to the crown. There was a thriving black market where looted goods were discreetly sold to merchants willing to profit from stolen goods. Some privateers maintained networks of contacts in neutral or corrupt ports, where they could offload their goods without questions. This allowed a large portion of the captured wealth to stay in the hands of the crew, rather than being confiscated by governments. This parallel economy enriched not only the privateers but also merchants and nobles who profited from indirect war. Throughout the centuries, privateers have been romanticized in literature. From popular stories to adventure novels, these sea warriors have been transformed into fictional heroes and villains. Alexander Dumas, for example, popularized the figure of the privateer in his novel, The Count of Monte Cristo. Additionally, privateer stories have inspired countless pirate tales and maritime adventures. Although the realities of life as a privateer were often harsh and brutal, the image left for posterity is often that of a brave adventurer, sailing the seas in search of fortune and glory. The life of a privateer was marked by alliances and betrayals. Sometimes, the enemy didn't come from outside but from within the crew itself. Mutinies were common, especially when the spoils weren't divided fairly or when the captain showed weakness. Moreover, the temptation to sell information to rivals or enemy navies was constant. In many cases, privateers switched sides, becoming mercenaries for the highest bidder. These betrayals were an integral part of life at sea, where loyalty was as valuable as gold. With the official abolition of the letter of marque, many privateers found themselves without an occupation. Some tried to adapt to the new reality, working as merchants or soldiers. Others, however, couldn't abandon the life of plundering and became pirates, hunted and hanged by the same nations that had once supported them. The end of privateering marked the end of an era where the seas were ruled by independent adventurers. National navies took full control of the oceans, and the free spirit of the privateers faded into the mist of history, leaving only their legends. Now that we've sailed through the stories of these sea warriors, the final question remains. In an era where the law was as fickle as the sea, what would you do with a letter of marque in hand? Would you be the hero or the villain of your own story? And remember, the sea will never forget its warriors. And if you enjoy the story of our warriors, just follow the channel.